All right, Crim 1, let's get started with Chapter 5, which is Overview of Policing. As you can obviously see, we're going to start talking about police in this section of the course. So, having said that, let's move on to defining policing. Generally speaking, on any given day, I ask students in class, like, how many of you have seen a police officer today? Most probably have at some point during the day. So they're very high profile work, but most of what they do, generally speaking, on a daily basis is not necessarily police work as we would define it. They do a lot of community relations. They do a lot of peacekeeping. And of course, they also do spend time enforcing laws. So the history of policing in the U.S., policing and the whole concept of what a police officer is or how laws are enforced has evolved throughout the history of the United States. Early on, it was kind of, as they say, vigilantism, self-appointed committees organized to suppress crime and punish criminals. These were just kind of the neighbors getting together and deciding how they could suppress crime and what kind of punishment was reasonable for the criminals. As you can imagine, it was probably pretty harsh punishment, and as vigilantism is kind of like a revenge type of scenario. So they also had slave patrols. Patrols were organized to keep slaves from escaping. Then they moved on to the English model. This is where neighborhoods, communities all got together and they would say, for example, Joe, Monday night is your night to watch. Johnny, Tuesday night is your night to watch. Enrique, Wednesday night is your night to watch. So they would, everybody would participate in making sure that there was someone watching over the community at all times. Then we moved on to the political era. And this is an era where a lot of corruption started because people became police officers really because of who their political party was and not necessarily because they were qualified to do the job. If it was a well-known friend of the police chief, then the police chief could just say, okay, you're a police officer now without any kind of background or training or any of that kind of stuff. So obviously pretty dangerous time. Professional era. I'm not sure what this 1392, that number's not right. I'm going to say from 1920, I think that's what that's supposed to say, to 1970. That's interesting that, of course, I just noticed that now. Anyways, professional era. So this is when police officers were actually required to go through testing and interviews and backgrounds and all that kind of stuff to make a police officer an actual professional job as opposed to getting hired because they knew somebody. And then finally, 1970 to present, community policing area. So, and we still do a lot of this. Police officers are focused pretty heavily on crime prevention, and it kind of depends on the size of the department and the amount of crime in any given city as to how much community policing can actually take place. I think Fresno PD, for example, they do have a community relations unit, I believe. But the police officers on your regular old beat cops, those guys and girls are spending a lot of their day just going from call to call to try and put fires out. Not literally, but you know what I mean. What's next? Structure of law enforcement. So in the sworn personnel, these are peace officers. When we talk about sworn personnel, we talk about peace officers. We also have non-sworn personnel. Those would be, God, my dog is going to start making noise. Okay, those would be dispatchers, clerical people, ID techs, people like that would be kind of non-sworn personnel. He's going to sit here and growl the whole time I'm talking. So we have a bunch of different levels of law enforcement. We have local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and then federal law enforcement. So local, just a random example, the Fresno Police Department, Fresno County Sheriff's Department, the Clovis Police Department, Sanger PD, Selma, any of those local or smaller towns, those are local law enforcement agencies. State law enforcement. Okay, so with state law enforcement, most commonly people think CHP, which is a state law enforcement agency, but you also have the Alcohol and Beverage Control. We have State Center Community College Police. We have Fresno State Police. So there are different levels, different agencies within the state as well. And then we have federal law enforcement. So federal agencies, generally speaking, the first one that people think of is the FBI. You have the CIA, the DEA, and there are tons of local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, but that's how they're broken up. Fragmentation. So fragmentation is not a good thing. It is the lack of coordination among law enforcement agencies in the same geographic region due to the existence of many small departments. So the perfect example of fragmentation and how it can be really dangerous is if you think 9/11. Before September 11th of 2001, there were a lot of law enforcement agencies that had little bits and pieces of information about a potential terror attack. Unfortunately, a lot of times law enforcement agencies don't talk to each other. They don't necessarily share information. So because of a lack of contact with other agencies, things can sometimes get missed. And that's probably the perfect example of fragmentation. We learned that some NYPD had some information, the FBI had some information, other agencies had other bits and pieces of information. Had all that information been put together, who knows, maybe 9/11 could have been avoided, but that is an example of fragmentation. Recruitment of law enforcement. Where do they recruit? Generally speaking, they're going to go to social media, online. They might come to the community colleges. They might come to high schools. They might go to the four-year universities. I've seen billboards along the side of the freeways. I have seen ads on the side of a bus. So they have their recruitment efforts are varied in their tactics. What are some issues with recruitment? There's a lot of issues with recruitment. Unfortunately, right now, a lot of people aren't really interested in working as police officers. It's obviously a pretty difficult job, and some people just don't want to mess with it because they feel like it's not worth the hassle, to be honest. Or they don't trust police, and they don't want to be part of something that they don't trust. The pay is generally pretty good, but could you make more money doing something else? Sure, if you have a college degree, and sometimes even if you don't have a college degree. Yeah, so you have to really want it and really want to make a difference and work with people in order to be a good police officer. So what does the selection process look like? Generally speaking, you have to take a written test, some oral interviews. In order to be a police officer, you need to go through the police academy. Background check is also another one. A lot of people fail the background check for a couple reasons. Number one, because they don't tell the truth. And number two, because I think a lot of people in California think that because recreational marijuana is legal, that it's okay to smoke marijuana and still apply to be a police officer. And that is not the case. How has the police force changed over the years? Back in the olden days, I think of the days like back when my dad was a police officer in the 1970s and 80s. It was almost unheard of for a woman to be a police officer. Ethnic minorities too were also kind of much more few and far between. So your typical cop during that time was probably what you picture in your mind, a white man. That has changed over the years. They don't necessarily require education yet, but that will change. It is changing, and it is in the process of changing in California. But they definitely, it's a desirable characteristic now for police officers to have gone to college as well. So how has the police force changed over the years? Another thing, they used to have height requirements. They used to have very specific requirements about vision. If your vision wasn't good enough, you couldn't be a police officer. So anyways, a lot of things have changed. They've evolved. But training, on to the next one, is ongoing and focuses on adult learning techniques. Police officers actually do a lot of training. It is absolutely, positively impossible for a police officer to be trained on every scenario they could possibly come across. So this is kind of the frustrating part, because people say, well, how come those officers aren't trained to deal with mentally ill people? They receive some training, maybe 8 hours of training a year on mentally ill people. It's kind of hard to really know your stuff if you've only done it for 8 hours. So. Okay, police subculture. All right, so we have occupational subculture and organizational subculture. Okay, so occupational subculture is referring to police officers in general. They are norms and beliefs embraced by most officers in a given country. Okay, so this is referring to all police officers across the United States. Police organizational subculture are norms and beliefs to a particular individual department. So if you have a chief that's super strict and very by the book, that whole agency is probably going to be super strict and very by the book. That's going to be that organizational subculture. If you have a chief that's never there and doesn't take care of business and doesn't treat his employees well, then you're going to have a different kind of organizational subculture in that particular department. Okay, so it can vary from department to department, and it oftentimes does. Then we come to the blue code of silence, adherence to a code of conduct that places loyalty to fellow officers above all other values by not reporting on a fellow officer's misconduct. This is a problem. And does it still exist? You bet it does. Yeah. I'm just going to throw a scenario out there. Think about being, let's say, a rookie officer, and your training partner, your field training officer, does something completely illegal. What are you going to do? If you report it, do you risk being known as a rat for the rest of your career? Do you risk fearing that officers aren't going to respond as quickly to you when you have an emergency call? Now, these things should not take place. They are absolutely, positively unacceptable. But do they take place? They do. It's gotten a lot better as police, the whole profession has become more professional, but it still exists. Police officers also have discretion, the authority to act in a manner that officers judge most appropriate for a given situation. So does a police officer have to arrest you every time you commit a crime? Do they have to give you a ticket every time they pull you over? No, they don't. They have discretion. They get to make a judgment call. There are some positives to that, and there are some negatives to that. Positives, think when you were a kid, and maybe you did something stupid, and maybe you did something stupid one time. If you'd gotten arrested for whatever that stupid thing was, would your life be different right now? So I would argue that sometimes police discretion is a positive. I also believe sometimes it's a negative because occasionally it is it's not used fairly, equally, even across the board. So that can definitely be a problem. Does that allow for influences and racial profiling? Yes, it does. So that is definitely one of the negatives of police discretion. I don't even know why I put that victim thing down there. Police misconduct, we've all seen it. Unfortunately, we're going to continue to see it. The majority of officers are honest, good, decent people. But the ones that do shady stuff are the ones that we all hear about. So abuse of authority, police disregard for policies, rules, or laws in the performance of their duties. Stealing money, beating someone, racially profiling on purpose, doing all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of abuses of authority. Noble cause, justification for wrongdoing committed by an officer on the premise that the ends justify the means. That is still not okay. Still not okay. And then we have corruption, misconduct motivated by personal gain, skimming seized narcotics monies. If you ever have a free afternoon, look up the Rampart unit from the Los Angeles Police Department, and you will see corruption like you could never imagine. This happened a while ago, but lots of arrests and officers stealing money. So I think that might be the last one. Oh no, private security is the last one. What happened? I'm sorry. Let me go back here. Maybe I should pause this. Okay, privatization, private security. A lot of people call them not fake cops. No, they call them something like that. But it is the privatization of government programs to the private sector. You all have seen private security. Some of you might even work private security. They unfortunately have a horrible job and get treated pretty disrespectfully. In Fresno, we've had several security officers, security guards, shot and killed at some of our local Motel 6s. These people are going out there making minimum wage and putting their lives on the line. So a lot, and most of them are not armed. Private security is the non-governmental private sector practice of protecting people, property, and information. And these are generally, like I said, the private security officers that you see. They are not linked with actual law enforcement. And I think that's it.